Acrylic paint is a fast-drying paint, and it's made of pigment which is suspended or mixed with acrylic polymer emulsion and basically different kinds of plastics and stabilizers and defoamers, but you don't really need to know all of that. But basically just know that it has this plastic quality to it when it dries. So the paints, they are water soluble, so you can mix them with water and you can either, make them a little bit more transparent, or when you're changing from one color to another, you use water to clean your brush. And once it's dry, it does become more water resistant than other paints. And depending on how much water you use, you can dilute it, but you can also use other acrylic gels and mediums and pastes. This makes it so that you can have a thicker application to your acrylic paint. You can also adjust the acrylic paint's drying time. You can adjust the texture of your acrylic paint with these different kinds of mediums. This is for a more advanced understanding of acrylic paint. I won't be using those in this series. I'm going to just be using water and paint and brushes and canvas to create my my acrylic paint artwork with you throughout this series. This is the brand that I get for my students, so that we have these small bottles. I also use Blick acrylic paint. These are very student grade type of paint. I also use a variety of brushes. I don't really teach with specific kinds of brushes because I like to keep it pretty approachable from wherever you're at. And so my brushes, I have some flat brushes and some round brushes and some smaller detail brushes. That's all you'll need for my videos, just a variety and a simple kind of basic brush. As you develop your skills, you might find that you like this hard edge, you have more straight lines in your artwork, or maybe you have a lot of curvy round shapes, and then you like to have a round brush to get to those edges. But for these videos, you just need a variety of brushes here. For my students, they also have these canvas boards that they'll be using. I got these from Blick. These canvas boards, they're pretty thin here. They're just a cheaper surface to paint on. They're already pre-done with gesso. So some canvases don't have this prime on it. This makes it so that it's easy to paint on. So this is just a simple canvas board that we will be using. And I also give my students a mixed media sketchbook. So that just means that this kind of sketchbook is something that we can do some light painting on. You don't want to add too much water to a mixed media paper, but we'll be using mixed media paper for some practice activities. You can also see that I have a tape. I tape off some sections in my paintings. This is a painter's tape from Scotch, which is for delicate surfaces. This is just something I use in my classroom to create some nice clean edges for our paintings while they're on this paper. If you're using something like masking tape, you'll want to reduce how sticky this is so it doesn't tear your paper apart. So what I always tell my students is to use your sleeve of your sweater and just pick up a little bit of that lint so it's not super sticky. Those are just some basic materials I use. I also keep a water bottle nearby, and this is just a small water bottle with water in it. So students have those at their desk. And you're going to see while I go through my painting, if I'm painting something and this acrylic paint dries super fast and I try to blend it with another color and it's dry, sometimes you can reduce the drying time by spritzing a little bit of water so that it's reignited so you can use it again to mix. So now let's talk about how I set up my paints, what kind of palettes I use. So these are the materials I use. I'm going to be using this putty knife, and for my classroom, the students will use something called plexiglass, which is a hard plastic, And this kind of plastic allows us to put a little bit of paint down on here. You put the paint down on the plexiglass. You can do all kinds of mixing, moving around, and make it reworkable. If it starts to dry on your plexiglass, you can spritz a little bit of water. It's a non-absorbent surface, so it stays wet faster. So that at the end of class, when you're done, what you can do is take this putty knife here and scrape away. And then you just take a paper towel and you wipe that away. If the paint starts to dry up, maybe it's dried on the plexiglass, all you have to do is spritz it with your water, let that set for about a minute, and then you can wipe it away. This is my favorite way to use acrylic paint. Now, not everybody has plexiglass and putty knives at home. So if you're trying to find something at home to use, I like to reuse my to-go containers. I'll use some foil, and that is, again, a non-absorbent surface so that it can go into here, and then I put like plastic over the top if I want to keep paint a little bit longer. With acrylic paint drying so fast, you really can't keep the paint wet for too long. Another material that I use often is this palette paper. So if my students don't have plexiglass, this palette paper is pretty nice. It's a waxy paper. You can kind of use parchment paper in a similar way, but this palette paper works best. And it just has this shiny, non-absorbent surface on the top, and on here you can put the paint down and mix on here, and then this would just get thrown out once you've covered everything completely. My suggestion about paint to my students is to look at the paint bottle as you're setting it up and pay attention to how you're mixing. What colors are you mixing? Write down specific colors if you're going to have to come back to something the next day or change your environment. This is your best way to remember what color combinations you're creating. I really try to keep my style and my painting pretty loose so I don't have to save colors of paint while I'm acrylic painting because it is so difficult to save. It's just a fast, really fast drying medium. So what you could do if you really want to keep it and maybe you're doing a really long, big project and you want to keep a specific type of paint, you can keep some of these plastic containers, reuse these plastic containers that you get from baby food jars or yogurt jars that have this like tight lid, and you can keep them in something like this. And I even have some students that will use these, cheaper little plastic palettes like this that I usually use with watercolor, and you could put the paint in here, and you really want to make sure that the air is not getting to it, so using something like a plastic wrap to save it. Again, this will over time dry because that's just the way that acrylic paint works. So I really encourage students to be free with their acrylic paintings, to document in their sketchbook the colors that they're using and really use the canvas and mix on the canvas as we paint. But you're going to see how I do that as we move further along. Now, I really encourage my students never to leave their brush just sitting in the water like this. This is going to make the bristles in the brush start to fall out over time. So because acrylic paint can dry on your brush so quickly, as you're working, if you're going to get rid of a brush, you really want to use the water, get as much of the paint off as you can, and use a paper towel to wipe away, but you could see that there's still some paint on there. So when we're cleaning our brushes, I encourage students to clean their brushes completely, and I have this kind of gentle, I don't have a brush soap. They do sell brush soap. But I like to just use more of like a gentle kind of soap in my classroom, organic and less chemicals, more so like essential oil type soaps. You hold your brush or your hand like this, like a cup, and use it like this to pick up some of the paint that's inside. This is for when you're done with a painting. You're gonna see, depending on the color there, whether you're really getting a lot of that paint out. So I'm just gonna kind of keep doing this, and you wanna see it pretty clear there. You know, you wanna have those bristles, you know, in line. And what's best is if, you know, it's drying straight up like this. But a lot of my students use a bin. So what they'll do is they'll keep it, you know, on something that we know that it's going to be flat. If you have your brushes against something and it dries like this, you're going to start to damage them. If you have them down in something, it will start to damage them. So you just want to make sure that this is like not touching, the bristles aren't touching anything as they're drying. When I am setting up my canvas and I'm doing something with paint, what I want to do is start out with small. I don't need to have large clumps of this paint. I can always add more. It's always better to add more paint later. So let's say I'm doing something with this paint and I'm mixing it up, so now you can see how nicely this mixes on the plexiglass. And you can really move to another spot on your plexiglass, and then, you know, you could take this color, move it over here, take another color, and add over here. You can see it's just a small drop that I'm working with. I don't like to have too many clumps of paint that I'm working with. Start small. So let's say I finish up a painting and this much paint is left over. Well, I still want to use it. I always keep a little side project going like this, where I've taped off the edges here, and I take whatever extra paint I got, just freely, you know, scoop it up, make some marks, because this could always be used for something. I like to create these very loose backgrounds, and then I'll just paint something on top of it some other day. So throughout this series, you're gonna learn so much about acrylic paint. I want you to explore color theory in a free-form exercise. I want you to learn how to blend your paints. I want you to learn all different types of brush strokes with acrylic paint. And then we're gonna go into some videos where I go from start to finish in creating a more finalized painting on canvas. So for the practice activities, we will be using your mixed media sketchbooks. And for my final bigger paintings, we are going to be painting on canvas board.